Our last talk of the year, it is my great pleasure to welcome Erin Riley from San Diego State in the Department of Anthropology. Thank you for coming to visit us. We're looking forward to your talk. And it's called Roadside Primates, Balancing Risks and Rewards in Anthropogenic Environments. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks. Okay, thanks everyone. Happy to be here. And I guess this is the last week of classes, yeah? So, all right. Well, yeah, so I just want to, Clark already acknowledged my department. I also wanted to note the project that I'm a part of, which is called Project Seed, which is a collaboration between SDSU and Hasanuddin University in Sulawesi, Indonesia, focused on the ecology of Sulawesi as well as ethnoprimatology, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the talk, of Dare. And Dare is the local name for the Sulawesi moor macaque species, which I'll also be talking more about. So before I get started in terms of the content, I did want to situate myself, right, give a little background about who I am as an academic. And so I earned my bachelor's degree in anthropology at Beloit College, which is a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. And so I took mostly, I wouldn't say four-field, but most of the sub-areas represented there. And I had an amazing opportunity of doing a study abroad in Zimbabwe, where I learned a lot about the anthropology of conservation. And I mention that because it was really instrumental in helping develop my ideas of who I wanted to become as an academic, although I didn't know it at the time. And then after taking several years off, I went to actually work and do behavioral care management for captive primates for a number of years, because I identified an interest in primatology as an undergrad, but didn't exactly know quite what I wanted to do with that. So I got some experience working in captivity, and then ended up going back to do also in anthropology, but I ended up at a program at the University of Georgia where they have a thematic focus in anthropology, very interdisciplinary, but the thematic focus was on environmental and ecological anthropology. And so that was my degree. And then because of the Institute of Ecology at the University of Georgia, there was also strong linkages there. And I earned a graduate certificate in conservation ecology and sustainable development, right? So that kind of gives my academic background. And so when I describe, people say, well, who are you as an academic? And I often describe myself as a bit of a hybrid, right? In the sense that I have training and interest in biological anthropology and primatology more specifically, particularly given that here in the United States, at least, primatology often has a home within anthropology and bioanthro more specifically. But again, a lot of my interest and background as well cover some other fields, including sociocultural anthropology, environmental anthropology, and conservation ecology and conservation biology. So a little bit of a hybrid. Okay, so with that background in place, essentially what I want to talk about today is kind of the current reality that we are living in, and that if for those of us that are interested in studying non-human primates, what we are finding is that it's increasingly difficult to find a primate population that has not been subject to at least some form of human influence. And that's in the contemporary era. And what's also very interesting is that a lot of scholars have been also demonstrating via different types of records, whether it's archaeological record, ethno-historical record, ethnographic record, that some cases this goes back in time as well, right? In the sense that primates have been encountering humans or human types over the course of a long period of history, right? But in the contemporary era, this is the moment that we're living in. And as a result, human-primate interfaces are quite widespread. And so what do I mean by a human-primate interface? Well, I define a human-primate interface as context in which primates, non-human primates, experience human-induced changes to their environment. These are also contexts where they may encounter and regularly interact with humans, and also contexts in which primates figure prominently within the lives and cultures of humans. So these are widespread, and if we think about the ways in which they are distributed across space, you can conceptualize them as kind of occurring across a gradient, right? As you move from what we may deem to be more kind of natural environments, like whether those are forested landscapes, savanna landscapes, where primates occur, they may be encountering humans there, including researchers. And then you can transition, for example, to the forest farm edge, where we see a lot of kinds of interactions between people and primates. as primates adjust to ecological changes to their environment, which involve, for example, the creation of agricultural land, so like in agro-ecosystems. And then there's also kinds of encounters that occur in some areas of the world in peri-urban and even urban settings, right? So a great example is in India, several cities, you've got monkeys running all over the place, right? For example, Delhi. So there are lots of different kinds of spaces where humans and primates can interface. My focus, I've had the privilege to be able to work across across this gradient, and so what I'm going to be focusing on today is a particular kind of interface that emerged. I would probably classify it within like peri-urban because it involves linear infrastructure, right? So roads that tend to be more common, obviously, in peri-urban and urban kinds of settings, but it's not really an urban setting, and you'll see more in a minute what I mean by that. So what are my goals today? So essentially what I want to do is highlight some of the work that myself, my colleagues, and my students have been working on a particular human-primate interface in the southern province of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And in doing so, I hope to be able to illustrate the value of using interdisciplinary and mixed methods approaches in this kind of work. And then I'll conclude by summarizing some of the conceptual and applied contributions of this kind of work, particularly with regard to how do we think about ways to manage these kinds of interface and ensure that people and wildlife, and more particularly primates, can coexist into the future. So let's start by situating ourselves geographically, right? Where is Sulawesi? So Sulawesi sits in the eastern part of Indonesia, right? Indonesia is an island nation, and it's made up of thousands of islands, only a proportion of which are inhabited by people. And so you can see Sulawesi indicated there. It's that funny shaped island that is there in the eastern part. It's the third largest island in Indonesia and the 11th largest in the world. So it's a pretty sizable island. It also is very interesting from an ecological perspective. It sits at the center of what's called Wallacea, which is a unique biogeographical zone where you see a very interesting combination of Asian and Australasian flora and fauna. It also, as a result, has very high levels of endemism, meaning that we have many species that occur on the island of Sulawesi that are not found anywhere else in the world. So it's attracted a lot of ecological attention. It also has a lot of cultural and linguistic diversity as well. So really a hotbed for all sorts of different kinds of research. And so the map on the right shows you our specific location in Sulawesi, so specifically in the southern province. And the site that I'm working at right now is in a national park, actually. So our study site is that yellow star right there. And a couple things I want to point out on the map is that, so again, it's a national park. Our site is within the national park, but the red line is a major road that bisects a portion of that park, and that's really the context where we are studying this current interface, right? So key elements of this current interface, again, a protected area. So, this park was, it's a long name. It's called Bantimurung Bulu Sarong National Park, so I'm just going to call it Babul because it's a mouthful to say. So this national park was created in 2004 as a way to protect some of the karst ecosystems. So a huge component of this national park is these tower karst formations. Karst is limestone, and some of them raised to almost 50 meters above sea level. Very, very interesting kind of geological history and forested area. So the park was created to protect this landscape and then the flora and fauna that lives within. As I mentioned, and as you saw from the map, there is a heavily trafficked road. And if you look at the image there, it looks like the road is pretty small, which it is, but I usually describe it in terms of its importance as being as important as the 5, right? So maybe it doesn't have as many lanes as the 5 does, right? But it certainly has the importance of it because it connects 2 port cities in the southern province. And Sulawesi is a highly mountainous island, which means that there aren't very many ways to get around. And so this is one of the only 2 ways you can get from one side of the peninsula to the other. So very, very important road. And the study species, the primate study species that lives within is the Moor macaque species. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about that species. And then the human behavior of interest in this case is provisioning, right? The deliberate feeding of wildlife by people. So the study species, again, is the moor macaque, and the moor macaque is one of the 7, well, depending on which taxonomist you talk to, Fudin classified the Sulawesi macaques into 7 different species, illustrated here quite beautifully by Stephen Nash. And you can see their respective distributions across the island of Sulawesi. And I've worked with several of the species over the course of my career, but since 2010, I've been studying the moor macaque, which is down in South Sulawesi. So one of 7 species. It's listed currently by the IUCN as endangered. And then a little bit of information about its natural history. This is a species that lives in cohesive social groups comprising both males and females, and of course their offspring. It's female philopatric, meaning that females stay within the group and the males are the ones that disperse out. In terms of group size, at least at this site, generally around 30 individuals. So for example, our main study group over the last 15 years has ranged in size from 31 to about 37. So roughly about 30 individuals. They are primarily frugivorous primates. They are semi-terrestrial. And in terms of their social style, compared to some of the other more despotic macaque species, they do show a fair amount of social tolerance among individuals, both among females, but also between males as well. So that kind of sets the stage in terms of understanding what primate species we're dealing with here. So as I mentioned, I first started working at this site in 2010, and at that time, we were largely spending most of our time in the forest as we were, I was doing a project on male-male social relationships, actually. And so I wasn't actually focusing on human-primate interaction kind of stuff. But what ended up happening is that around 2015, we started to see this shift in their behavior where it used to be that they would come to the road and then move on, right? This one main study group. And so, because the road kind of bisected their home range, right? But starting in about 2015, what we started to see is that they started to kind of start hanging out along the road. And if you look closely, you see a few individuals there, right? So this kind of roadside resting behavior, right? And as a result of that, what ended up happening, of course, is that they became visible to people passing in vehicles, and then people started feeding them, right? And again, this was not something that we had seen prior to this time before. And so a lot of people have asked me, okay, well, what accounts for this shift? Like, what happened? Why did they all of a sudden start hanging out on the road? And we don't know exactly for sure. Part of it is that this happened while I was not actually there. So all of a sudden my collaborators were saying, the monkeys are hanging on the road a lot more. So, but we have some ideas about what might have been happening. And so one idea is that this specific social group where we first saw this behavioral innovation has a long history of being habituated to people. And so some of us thought, well, maybe it's just an extension of that habituation. Now they're just hanging out. They're used to people. Now they're just hanging out, and they've been fed. And so they've been kind of almost conditioned to keep coming back to the road. And I think that probably explains why they continue to come back, but not necessarily the initial shift. Like, why did they start doing that? And then we've also speculated about whether it's possible that this initial shift happened because if you look in this image here on the right, you see that there's like some makeshift stalls. So this is a national park, even though it's a road that is inside the national park. Technically, there's not meant to be a lot of human activity at this site, right? But local villagers started setting up these kind of makeshift stalls where they would sell, food items and other kinds of things, forest products like honey, and a local drink called ballo. And so at that time in 2015, it just started to emerge where there was a couple of stalls. And so, the presence of the stalls would mean vehicles would stop. There would be food items left behind, trash, and so forth. And so we wondered if that was not a kind of an initial attractant for the monkeys. And then once they started to become, provisioned, again, kind of perpetuated the idea, right? Or that behavior on their part. But we don't know for sure, right? But these are just some ideas about why that shift initially occurred. I should also note that the site is currently undergoing rapid change, right? And this is, again, the reason why I brought up the importance of the road prepares us for this next bit, in the sense that you saw that first image that showed you it wasn't a very wide road, right? So it's a 2-lane road and 2-lane barely, right? And so because of that, and it's navigating through this karst form, there was like traffic jams and the trucks couldn't get by and it was kind of a mess. And so the Ministry of Human Development, in conjunction with the Ministry of Forestry, have been under, like for years and years and years, under discussion regarding the development of this road, an expansion project, right? They had to do a lot of environmental impact assessments and so forth and so on. So essentially what they did is eventually they finally came to agreement, and this project, this road widening project, began in 2022. And so what I'm showing you in some of these images, I don't know if hopefully you guys can see, it involved basically the destruction of forest for about 5 to 10 meters on either side of the road, right, because you've got to make space for the road, and even the destruction of some of the karst formations as well, right? So this has been ongoing since 2022. It really began in earnest, and you can see what that looks like. And the monkeys continue, though, throughout this time period, continue coming to the road, which we were somewhat surprised about given the loud noises, the increase in human presence, and karst formations like just being crumbled, and chainsaws, and I mean it was mayhem really for particularly during the early stages of it, and yet they kept coming, right? So a lot of ongoing road construction. The project was supposed to be finished at the end of last year, but was delayed, as many things are often in Indonesia. But I'm been told that it's very, very close to being done at this point. So I'm actually going to the field just in a couple weeks. So it's going to look very different since I last was there last year. Another development is that, as I mentioned, this started in just one group, right? So it was, remember when I was telling you, well, was it just this group because they have a long history of habituation to people? But over the years, so it started with Group B, our main study group. By 2018, during some of my field visits, we started noticing another group, which we've labeled Group C. And then as of this year, we now see more than 8 groups that are now spending time along the road. So it's no longer something unique to Group B, it has spread to other groups. And so this is a map showing you this is an Indonesian student who took GPS locations of different groups along there's an 11-kilometer stretch that passes through the national park. And so he did this work trying to figure out how many groups we're talking about now. So it's really become much more of a population-wide issue as opposed to just one single group. So complex human-primate interfaces like this really require innovative and interdisciplinary approaches, right, to understand what's going on. And so one approach that we've drawn from is an area of research called ethnoprimatology, which some of you may be familiar with. So ethnoprimatology was first coined actually by a cultural anthropologist, Les Sponsel, in 1997 as a result of his work in Amazonia. And it's really been picked up by a lot of folks, particularly within primatology. And from the get-go, has always been really interdisciplinary, although I think some of the earlier work was largely done by sociocultural anthropologists, and I would say today it's more largely done by primatologists. But it really recognizes the importance of drawing from multiple fields, both in terms of theoretical framings as well as methods. So it pulls from primatology, it pulls from sociocultural anthropology, as well as environmental and ecological anthropology as a way to study the ecological and cultural interconnections between people and primates. So some of its key principles are, first off, that humans are a part of nature and not separate from it, right? Also, it recognizes that primates that live in anthropogenic contexts are worthy of study, right? In a historical sense, primatology used to think, oh, well, these animals are affected by people. They're not worth investigating. And ethnoprimatology recognizes the value of studying primates that live in anthropogenic settings and recognizes that behavior that is impacted by anthropogenic factors is not aberrant, for example, but rather reflects a capacity for flexibility and adaptability, right? So a good example, I remember chatting with Shirley Strum many, many years ago. I wouldn't say she categorizes herself as an ethnoprimatologist, but she was one of the first researchers to see crop foraging behavior, right? Where primates move into agricultural land and eat it, and yet people always thought, oh, that's not natural behavior, you shouldn't be studying that. And she always thought, well, why not, right? This is an example of them adjusting to changing resource landscapes, right? So that's kind of the idea behind ethnoprimatology, is that we accept these kinds of spaces as worthy of study. And then ultimately, what is the key unit of investigation? Again, it's these relational spaces between people and primates, right, as kind of co-shaping each other's behaviors. That's kind of the essence of ethnoprimatology that informs a lot of the work that we've been doing. So at this site, again, there are a constellation of what you could label as both risks and rewards, right? The road itself is inherently risky because there are vehicles traversing across it. So the animals, the primates could be potentially struck and killed by passing vehicles. There's also the likelihood of increased interactions with people, which could lead to negative kinds of interactions. There are thermoregulatory issues associated with hanging out on the road versus compared to being in the forest, right? At the same time, the road represents a place where they're getting food and people food, which could potentially be, often is high in calories, a quick source of energy, right? So there are also benefits associated with coming to the road. So we've been really interested in trying to understand how they're navigating this trade-off, if you will. And so we've pulled from ethnoprimatology, as I've just described, but we've also been drawing from road ecology, which is an area in ecology which is interested in understanding how linear infrastructure like roads affects wildlife and the environment. And we've also been pulling from frameworks in behavioral ecology. So for example, the landscape of fear framework is something that we've been drawing from. This is a framework that recognizes that animals respond to kinds of the risks and within their environment and so they have to make decisions about how to move across space in relation to those risks, right? So the idea is that there's spatial temporal variation in risk, and so we expect animals to respond and adjust to that in terms of their movement and their activity patterns. This framework was largely used, or historically used within like predator-prey dynamics, but a lot of researchers have recognized that anthropogenic factors or disturbance is in some ways analogous to predation risk, particularly if humans are predators as well, right? And so we can use this as a framework to understand how they might navigate some of these kinds of constraints, particularly like, for example, in a roadside dynamic. So collectively, we've been drawing from these different frameworks really to understand how humans and the monkeys at this site are kind of co-adapting to this emerging interface, and to think about ways that we can promote human-primate coexistence moving forward. So some of our primary research themes coalesce around key topics in primate behavioral ecology, also in studying the nature of the kinds of interactions that we're observing at this site, human-primate interactions, the human dimensions component of it, right? So really understanding why people are choosing to interface with these animals. And then, of course, we need to know something about the habitat as well, right? So this is where my collaborator in Indonesia, he's a tropical forest ecologist, so lends his expertise in that realm. So what I thought I'd do is just give you a sampling of some of the work that we've been doing over the last decade, and present some of our results just on some of the key topics that we've been interested in looking at. So first off, how does this interface affect Moor macaque sociality? So one of the first things that we were interested in looking at with regard to this interface is how does it affect the social networks within the social group, right? And so we started this work with our main study group, Group B, and their behavior presents an opportunity for us to kind of track them across space, right? So because they not only use the roadside, but they also continue to use the interior forest, which is away from humans, except for us as researchers, of course. And so what we did is that we used data collected on proximity, so patterns of proximity between individuals, and then affiliation behavior, so the frequency at which individuals are engaging in friendly behavior with others in their group, to then construct two separate networks for the group, right? One using data from when they're just in the forest, and then one using data when they're on the road, right? And so here you have two social networks depicted, right, illustrated here. And so the circles, or what we call nodes, represent individuals, and then the lines or the edges represent connections between individuals. And so what you can see just by looking at this descriptively is that you see that there are way fewer connections between individuals when they're on the road compared to when they're in the forest, right? And so this analysis demonstrated that the social networks of the group is much denser in the forest compared to the road, right? And so we can think about how that might impact all sorts of different things with regard to particularly given that we know how important social bonds are for primates and for primate fitness, right? So this was one of the first things that we started looking at. We are continuing that work. Right now, I have a postdoc who's been at our site since last June, collecting a lot of behavioral data. Some of the other things that we're interested in looking at, they're currently underway, is looking at the extent of group spread, right? And so we know that many cohesive social groups will often spread out in terms of their foraging behavior. But we're interested in understanding how that operates at this site, with this, on the road. Also looking at evidence of subgrouping behavior. This is not necessarily a species known for subgrouping, but we're starting to see the emergence of social cliques where certain individuals are spending more time with others, and we're trying to understand what's happening there, do we see concurrent patterns? Are there some individuals that prefer to be with others, and why? And then also potential for group fission. Very interestingly, one of the other groups that we're studying, so we're now extending our observations to not just group B, but another group, group C, is that group C, which is more recent to the road, has now formally split into two groups. And we think what happened is that they probably couldn't come to a consensus about spending time on the road because some of them just did not want to do that. And so now part of the group, so group CA is on the road often, and group CB never comes to the road, right? So really interesting factors. So this wasn't an ecological issue in the sense of like reaching carrying capacity and they had to fission because they got too big. This seems like a consensus. They couldn't come to consensus and had to make a decision from there, which is not something we've seen before at this site. And we're also interested in looking at how provisioning itself affects patterns of behavior, social behavior. So levels of aggression, affiliation, and so forth. So I have a master's student who's going to be focusing on that this summer. Excuse me. Okay, what about some basic kind of behavioral ecology topics like activity budgets, habitat use, and diet? So let's start with habitat use. So as I mentioned at the outset, prior to 2015, we saw no roadside use behavior, right? So 0% of time. Looking at data just across two slices of time, again, we have some ongoing analyses here, but I just wanted to present some of the work to you guys, is that in 2016, 2017, when we first started studying this in earnest, 17% of our observation time the group was spending on the road. And looking at some of our data from this past year, we're seeing a percentage of about 20%. So doesn't seem like, again, we're doing some more rigorous analyses with regard to this, but just looking at this from a percentage time, we're seeing somewhat comparable use across time, which is interesting. The other thing that we're looking at too is whether or not we see differences across different age, sex classes in terms of their use of space, right? Because the interesting thing about the road is that the group can space themselves out where some individuals are right there on the road or roadside, but then some are kind of using the forest nearby as kind of more safer refuge, right? So we're actually tracking it across different age sex classes. And what we found is that actually males, this is what we would predict, right? Because males are generally predicted to be less risk averse, is males are significantly more likely to be found alongside the road compared to other, say, age sex classes. So we're going to continue to monitor this, and we actually have some data in between that time that we hope to involve to track it over time. So that's habitat use. What about how they distribute their time across different activities, right? So the way that primatologists assess kind of this element is to construct what we call an activity budget, right? Partitioning time. And you spend time in this means that you can't spend time doing this, right? So we're interested in understanding how they divvy up their time across different activities. And the thing so here I'm presenting 3 different time periods, and you can see we have some variation in behavioral records. Our current time period is ongoing, But here is just to give you a sample of what we're seeing thus far. And the thing to point out here is that you see I have this category called survey. It's kind of like scanning behavior, looking. You could also call it vigilance, for example. But essentially, in the beginning, we saw no evidence of this, right? And by 2016, 2017, they were spending a good portion of their time sitting, but not just sitting and resting, but paying very close attention to what's happening in their environment with regard to the cars and whatnot. And we're still seeing that today. And you can see that there were some changes in social behavior as well as time spent feeding and foraging, right? So again, time engaged in scanning your environment is time taken away from other fitness enhancing activities. So this is something we want to be tracking. It's interesting though, because vigilance behavior, there's a lot of discussion in the literature about how do we measure and monitor vigilance behavior, right? Because at this point, is it that they're actually vigilant, or are they actually watching because they're just wanting to make sure that they're just about ready for when somebody's going to give them food, they can jump on it, as opposed to I'm watching this behavior because I'm scared, right? So this is something that we're trying to see if we can tease out, at least in terms of their own behaviors.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
Sorry. Is this just time allocation while they're near the road, or this is all of their time allocation?
Yeah, so this is all overall. And so then we also analyze it, okay, of the time that they're spending on the road, what proportion, but this is their overall activity budget, yeah, or activity budgets across time. Okay, the next thing I wanted to show is diet. So here I've collapsed our different food. We collect more detailed information on dietary behavior, but what I'm showing you here is what I'm calling native foods, which could be any kind of plant part, right, and as well as insects. And then that the orange color is provision food, so anything that they're given by people. And the way that this donut is set up is that the inner circle is the earlier years, and then as you move outwards is later. And so what you can see is in the early years in 2016, 2017, provision foods accounted, again, this is overall feeding records. So all feeding records, devoted to feeding on item, we would note what kind of food it is. You could see a very low percentage early on, and that percentage continues to grow over time, where more and more of their diet comprises provision foods. We're also seeing, accordingly, when they are roadside, that their diet is less diverse. So they're consuming fewer native foods when they are spending overall, but then also when they're roadside. And, we can think about, okay, what does that mean in terms of their ability to meet their nutritional needs? There's a lot of discussion in primatology and broader fields about this idea of nutrient balancing, right? So that primates and other wildlife, for that matter, are eating things that create a balance of the different macronutrients that they need. And so, a future area of interest would be, are they able to meet their nutritional needs, given that they're not eating as diverse of a diet, right? Part of the reason why diversity is good is because it introduces the opportunity to eat, to get all, the kinds of contributions, macronutrient that we need to sustain life and reproduction, right? So this is a somewhat of a concerning view to see the extent to which provision foods. And you might be thinking, okay, what are people giving them, right? People are provisioning them basically anything and everything, right? For the most part, people are giving them whatever they have in their cars, right? Because this is this is people moving through the national park. They're not necessarily coming to see the monkeys, right? So we've seen people toss them anything from corn on the cob that has either been eaten already or not eaten. Bananas, everybody thinks monkeys like bananas, which of course they do. So bananas are a big hit, but then they'll give them baked goods and chips and cookies and bread, right? So banana is great, but fried dough, maybe not so great, right? So these are the kinds of things that people are feeding them. I've even seen them throw them. So most Indonesians love spicy food. So like when you buy these like little things that are like empanadas, they come with little packets of like hot sauce. and I've seen people throw that to them, and the monkeys are always like, yeah, no, I don't want that, right? So they are discerning a little bit in their choices with regard to the foods. Okay, what about ranging behavior, right? Another area of interest in behavioral ecology, of course, is, and so for this, this is also another thing that we looked at early on, because we took advantage of the fact that we had ranging data collected on Group B, our main study group, from 2010, 2011, which was way prior to the start of this shift. And then we had the data that we collected in 2016, 2017. And so we used those data sets to see, to make some predictions about what we would expect to see. And this is a topic that has been investigated at other sites where primates are provisioned. And what we know about the effects of provisioning on primates is that, if we think about what are the foods, like the ones I just described to you guys, oftentimes human foods tend to be, they're palatable, right? They're energy rich. They tend to also be easily digested. And usually in provisioning context, they are spatially concentrated, right? So particularly at sites where people are coming to the monkeys to give them food. And so maybe some of you have been to some of those sites, like in, for example, Bali in Indonesia is a very classic site where provisioning occurs, but there's many other sites as well. And so in some cases, human foods may have energetic advantages over wild foods, right? Because of these attributes. And so because of this, previous research has actually shown that groups that are provisioned by people will tend to restrict their ranging behavior, right? Because they can satisfy new nutritional needs easier because they're spatially concentrated, they get quick sources of energy, right? So the way that we see that in their behavior is that they show smaller home ranges and perhaps travel shorter distances within the day, right? And so that was the expectation that we went with based on previous research, also deriving from, theoretical ideas. But that's not what we found. So again, we looked at overall home range. And so what we found is, so what you're seeing, this is on the 2010, 2011, and here's the group's home range in 2016, 2017. So that tan color is what we would call the overall home range. And then the red constitutes what we would call kind of the core area of the group. And then the red line is the road, of course. So what we saw was that actually there was an increase in the overall home range of the study group. And you can also see that they extended their home range in a southward direction. And then more of their core area was actually found in greater proximity to the road, right? So we're seeing some shifts in their behavior, but again, they increased their home range, not constraining it, right? Which was not what we predicted. Similarly, we had predicted, given previous research, that they would show shorter daily travel distances, and that's not what we found, right? We found an increase in the daily travel distance. So again, the results did not support our predictions, and so we were left to kind of explain, well, what's going on here? And we think, again, part of the explanation for differences from what we predicted, given what other sites have found, is the nature provisioning at our site. Again, it's a moving target, right? Because the way that provisioning is happening is from vehicles that are moving. And so what we are observing is that the monkeys are actually following the vehicles as they move, often, sometimes hoping that by following them, they're gonna give them food. And so that might explain why we're seeing these larger travel distances. And then also the shift in where the home range is, that it matters to look at the road at that point, because the road, that map that I showed you, that where they extended it southward, that's precisely where the road, where there's actually space where cars could pull over if they were interested. And so sometimes cars would pull over and then the whole group would go running down there, right? But they're starting to encroach on other groups' home range, right? And so that's something that we've been interested in looking at moving forward, and I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, and then another area of interest that we started looking at beginning in 2023 was decision-making with regard to what are called collective movements, right? So collective movements is an area of research, not just in primates, but anything where you have animals that are making decisions, and how do you have individuals come to a consensus about when and where they're going to travel, right? And we're also interested in understanding who initiates those kinds of movements, right? So we were interested in understanding, decision making at this site, particularly just overall, but also who's making the decisions about when and where, when to come to the road, and how are they coming to that consensus. And so this was some work led by one of my former master's students, and we just published this work earlier this year in AJP. And essentially what we did is, again, led by Josh, is looked at, first off, because collective movements hadn't been studied yet in this species, we characterized the nature of what a collective movement looks like. We were also interested in understanding, okay, how is the decision-making, what is this decision-making style in this species, right? So in other species, some species, it's limited to just, one or two individuals. In some species, it's what we call equally shared, meaning, anybody could initiate a movement. In other species still, it's what we call partially shared, where you have maybe it's several different individuals, right? And so what we found is that collective movements in this species, at least at this site, is partially shared, right? So no one individual was the only one who did it. Several individuals were responsible. We did find that males were more likely to initiate collective movements compared to other age sex classes, although we did see dominant females initiating some of these movements. And then again, because this is a site where they spend time in the forest, and then they also spend time roadside, we were interested in understanding, what factors would predict initiation, given where the destination was. Was it roadside or was it still within the forest? And what we found is that that dominance was a significant predictor of initiating collective movements when the movement was going to the roadside. And so that suggests to us that perhaps the nature of the distribution of provision foods is more clumped than we thought, because perhaps what's going on is that the dominant individuals are like, we're going roadside because I'm about to monopolize a bunch of bananas, right? And so, whereas prior to that, we thought it was less clumped because of the moving nature of provisioning, right? And so we think that potentially explains why dominance was a significant factor explaining initiation, at least when moving towards the road. So we're going to continue kind of looking at this, particularly about some of the nuanced behaviors that are part of the collective movement. So how do more macaques signal to others, hey, it's time to go, right? And just to clarify, a collective movement is very different than just like, because a social group will be spread out and individuals will do their, respective movement. But a collective movement is when all of a sudden the group is like, we're moving, right? And you can discern those kinds of differences once you have a better understanding of the nature of their behavior. Okay, so decision making, again, we're interested in also the human dimension of this as well. So why are humans choosing to interface with these animals? And so we've been investigating the kind of the human dimension of this, both by observing human behavior, so by looking at provisioning behavior by people. And so again, we have analyses ongoing with regard to this. But what's interesting is that it appears that the rate of provisioning is somewhat stable, right? We haven't seen a significant increase in the number of provisioning events across time. And so that's been interesting. And then we've also, via the interview work that we've been doing, trying to understand people's perceptions of this behavior and also their perceptions of the primates, right? And so some of the themes that are emerging, at least early on from our analysis of our interview work, are a few things. First off, a lot of people are conveying how provisioning is probably directed via a sense of empathy, right? People see these animals and they're like, oh, but they look hungry, right? This is a common response that we get. And it's largely because the way in which they are interpreting the monkey's behavior, right? In macaque society, as we like to say, it's impolite to stare, right? If you're a macaque, do not stare at one another, right? But the macaques sit there and they're like, Clark, when will you be giving me food, right? So there's this, and so the ways in which people are interpreting macaque behavior are actually very, very interesting because they are perceiving it to be, well, they are telling me to feed them, right? And that's how so it's this empathetic drive, right? Another thing that's been really interesting that's come out of our interview work is this wild tame divide, right? And so some previous work that my students and I have done on human primate interfaces have found that at this site, people will differentially view monkeys, the same species, the ones that they see in the forest farm interface, those animals are wild but naughty. And these monkeys, these roadside monkeys, are jinak, that's the Indonesian word for tame, and funny. So the words that they use to describe these animals, same species, very different based on context. But what's been interesting is that the novelty of this behavior, like first it was really cool. It's like, oh my God, there's monkeys on the road. And now it's become, now 10 years later, it's more common, there's more groups. So the novelty of it is waning. I think the monkeys are becoming more bold with regard to people, and people are becoming more frightened. And so now people's discourse is shifting. They're tame, but they're naughty. So the words that people are using to describe these animals are shifting over time as well, which is very, very interesting. So, if they're becoming more and more fearful of the animals and the monkeys are becoming more and more bold, that's cause for concern because we certainly don't want people getting scratched and bit and things like that. We haven't seen any of that to date, right? But so again, we're continuing. This work is ongoing, right? Other things that we have planned moving forward is that one of my students is going to be focusing on interactions with plastics. I don't know if you've noticed in some of the images that I've shown here that there's a huge waste problem, and this is characteristic of all of Indonesia, actually. And so, like, all along the road, there's trash. And it has always been that, but it's like gotten worse and worse, and the roadside stalls don't help. And so now provisioning doesn't help because it's not like they just take a chip bag and dump the chips, they just toss the whole bag, and so you end up with trash out there as well. And so one of my students is going to be focusing on interactions with plastic. We're also interested in understanding kind of competitive regimes with regard to provision foods, right? So seeing who gets access to this. This will help us better understand motivations to come to the road. And then the other thing that we're seeing as well is the emergence of these kind of new social traditions with regard to how they're interfacing with people, right? So here you have Abu, who's one of our subadult males, who is very naughty. Although now he's more interested in monkey females. So he used to always charge at us and whatnot and test the boundaries, but he's not interested in us anymore. He's interested in females because he's of age. But he likes to do this jumping behavior. So every time the car goes by, he starts jumping and jumping and jumping, and it's worked, right? Then they hand over food. So we're seeing behavior like this. We're also seeing bipedal begging behavior, so the emergence, and this has also been seen in other macaque species at other sites where they are provisioning. So this is very interesting, and of course, it speaks to the role that humans play in the emergence of these kinds of innovations, which is, I think, particularly interesting. So, this is one of our four park rangers who I've worked with for a long time. They call him locally the monkey whisperer because he's worked there forever. And this is an adult male who used to be in the social group and is no longer there anymore. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, what we've been working on so far. Again, the study of the balance of risks and rewards. Again, as I mentioned, primates living in these kinds of spaces, I think this is a really interesting area of research overall in the sense that it helps us better understand primate adaptability, and in particular, the role that anthropogenic factors have as far as, as part of primates socioecology, right? We generally think of primate socioecology as just focusing on the ecological environment, but if we think of humans as part of nature and playing a role in that socioecology, then we are offered interesting ways to look at the ways in which people figure into socioecology. At our site in particular, it looks like the monkeys are perceiving the rewards to outweigh the risks. And we see that, for example, on the basis of increased roadside use, right? The fact that we have age sex classes who we would predict to be more risk averse, showing roadside use themselves. At the same time, they are not completely abandoning native foods, right? They continue to forage in the interior forest and rely on resources within. So, that's important. And I should note too that the road is still risky. To my knowledge, we've lost 2 individuals, which over a 10-year period is not actually a lot. There might be more, but I'm not 100% certain. But we recently lost an infant, which was really sad. But there is still risk involved by being roadside. But we think that there's been a desensitization to this dynamic, where particularly given that we're seeing particularly risk averse. So here, look at this juvenile. This is an example of the bipedal begging, right? So this is an age category that we wouldn't necessarily expect to be spending a lot of time roadside, and yet we are, and even infants, right? So, but long term, what kinds of fitness effects should we be concerned about? Particularly, as I mentioned, the diet, a less diverse diet, the impact on social relationships, things like that. As I mentioned, the roadside behavior innovation has spread, right? It started in one group, and now we're talking about several different groups. And so we've only can speculate at this point about how did it spread to other groups, right? Males disperse from their natal groups. So was it that certain males, we don't track, I don't have the resources to have we don't have full-time data collection, unfortunately, at my field site. And we haven't tracked males as they disperse from their natal groups. But that is a possibility, right? But at this point, we don't know necessarily how this has spread to other groups. But it does appear to be promoting generational habituation, in the sense that these animals are habituating themselves to human presence. It's, when you think about primatology fieldwork, it's the people habituating the monkeys or the primates to their presence. In this case, it's the primates, habituating themselves to us, right? We'll continue to, as a result of our research, it's possible that we'll see the emergence of other behavioral innovations. And again, very interesting to consider the roles that humans play in the emergence of these kinds of things. And then lastly, another area, there's lots of questions still yet to be answered, but one in particular that we haven't yet looked at is the nature of relationships between groups, right? So I've told you about data that we have within social groups, but as you guys saw from that map I showed you that showed the distribution at different groups across space, we're seeing overlapping ranges now. We're seeing a lot of much more frequent interactions between social groups, and so that's going to be an interesting element to study as well. And how that might impact dispersal and all other things that relate to fitness. Also, of course, is thinking about this from an applied perspective, right? I think many of us in primatology would argue that we're beyond the point where we can only do research for fundamental, science, that we also need to be thinking about applied dimensions as well. So what does this mean for conservation, particularly given that this is an endangered species? And also for coexistence, right? Over the years, we've worked with the national park. We started by trying to do put up these signs that tell people, or ask people, please don't feed the monkeys, and at least tell them why, right? Because you can just say, don't do it, but if you don't tell why, maybe people are not likely to follow suit. And to be quite honest, I'm not convinced that these worked, and they also don't last in a tropical rainforest environment. I think part of the problem is that there are other sites in Indonesia where you can go and you're allowed to feed monkeys, so why can't you do it here, right? So there's all sorts of disconnects. Also, the national park will provision the monkeys themselves, not on the road, but in the forest for tourism and media. And so people see that and they're like, well, why can they feed them and then we can't, and so it's pretty complicated. For those people that study primates, once they've learned that they can get human food, it's really, really hard to get them to stop. And so many of us would argue that the attention really needs to focus on human behavior, right? How do we shift human behavior? And so that's why, the ethnographic work is super important, because if we understand the motivations behind why people are doing it, maybe that can help us redirect different types. So like, let's say people are really like, oh my God, I didn't know that this was a species that only we have here. I want to protect it, right? And so thinking about things like that, right? So a lot of that work is going to inform our outreach. And so last year we started developing outreach materials for local schools. So this one was super fun. It's called Hati Hati Monyet, which literally means like, be careful, monkey. And we came up with some games. This is a collaboration with one of my collaborators, Amanda Ellwanger, and her students from Georgia State University. So they learn, this is a thing where they actually learn a little bit about what it means to be a monkey and how you live in a group and you have a family, right? So this is like the monkey family. And then some other kinds of things that talk about what monkeys eat and what will make them sick and things like that. So we're trying to do more education outreach. And also at the site, we've been trying to help build local capacity, right? So get more Indonesian students interested in doing this kind of research, and maybe eventually lead some of this outreach, because it really should be done by Indonesians, not always from foreigners. And so over the last 3 years, and coming up this summer as well, I'm gearing up for another pretty busy field season. We've been doing some capacity building in the field. So this work is ongoing and involves a lot of different people who I'm grateful to. My Indonesian counterpart, Prof. Oka, who's pictured right here, and the University, Hasanuddin University, all of the field assistants who really make this work possible, and my students who are there doing a lot of the research while I'm busy teaching and whatnot, my postdoc, my collaborators, and of course the funders who make it possible, and hopefully won't take my funding away currently. So with that, and so thank you, and thank you to Clark and to Connie for the invitation, for organizing this, and to you all for being here. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Let's
Sure.
open it up for questions. You can go ahead and call them. Thank you, Susan.
Hi, Sue. Yeah.
Yeah, I had some questions about the social network.
Yeah.
So you talked about the fission. To what extent, in a normal macaque society, you'd predict that they fission along matrilines, right? So to what extent did that fission break up along matrilines as opposed to attitude towards the road? Did you look at those two things?
Yeah. So my postdoc just told us about the fact that now they're no longer. So this is Group C. She now knows who's who, but we don't necessarily have the problem of not having sustained research over many, many years is that we don't always know who's related to whom, right? And so I'm not sure we would be able to know necessarily, did it fission on the basis of matrilines because of that. I guess moving forward, we could track that, right? But again, if we don't have the data to know that, we won't necessarily know. But
you could end up with that same pattern if they just fissioned because the group was getting too big or whatever, just along matrilines, and then of course they would become enemies, and one would be forced away from the road.
Yeah.
And it might look like that one just didn't want to be under the road when actually they did. There's this new inter-group competition dynamic.
Yeah, I think the reason why my postdoc thinks it might be a roadside consensus problem is because when she first started trying to habituate them to the extent that we could follow them, not just on the road, but in the forest, she noticed, well, wait a minute, where's half the group, right? And so there was always individuals that weren't coming to the road. So then in the forest, she would encounter them, right? And so I think what happened is that over time, they just started spending less and less time together, and now that's where we're at. But I'm going to be curious to see from the early stages of that observation, if there's, the individuals, how they made decisions with regard to that. But unfortunately, we don't have the matriline data to know if it's split that way. Yeah.
I mean, does that species have the same attraction or same social inheritance of rank?
Yeah, they do.
You might be able to, I mean, it wouldn't be perfect.
Yeah.
Measure your kinship, right? But if they were typical macaques, then you could kind of discern the kinship from the rank. I mean, not perfect.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that if we have, if we know who's who and we can track who was where at what point, and then based on affiliative data, construct a dominance hierarchy, we might be able to get there as close as we could, yeah. Because it would be interesting to know if it could be a combination of both, right? Like they couldn't come to consensus, but it was also matriline based. Yeah, but they were never. It was never. It didn't appear to be because the group grew too large. Because now we've got only 15 and 18 or something like that, right? Which is noticeably smaller than the other groups. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question on the collective movement portion, in which you said that the dominant individuals would move the group towards the road, and that led you guys to believe that the resources were clumped. Would you be able to expand a little bit more about like how those two ideas are connected? I'm just unfamiliar.
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, like when. So okay, let me back up a second. So in macaque society, there's often, and Sue was kind of getting at this, that there are dominance hierarchies within, and some of the macaque species are what we call more despotic, in the sense that they have very strict dominance hierarchies where the higher you are, the greater access to different resources, and that's something not necessarily unique to macaques, but how it plays out. The more macaque is one of what we call, their social style has been dubbed to be more socially tolerant, in the sense that it doesn't mean that they don't show dominance hierarchies. They do, but they tend to be more tolerant in who they allow to be around others, right? And so if, for example, if you're watching like the rhesus macaque, it's very easy to see that if a resource has been thrown in one spot, which would mean that it would be clumped, you can predict, given what we know about that species social style, who's going to monopolize that spot, right? In a more socially tolerant species, you might still see dominant individuals there, but they may tolerate lower ranking individuals around them, right? And so I guess the point that what we were thinking is that because of the moving nature of provision, so like the cars are moving and food is just kind of being thrown out the window. And so we assume that perhaps, unlike other sites where provisioning occurs, where it does tend to emulate a clumped distribution of food, if something's clumped, then you can monopolize it, right? And in which case you might predict the more dominant individuals to be like, we're headed there because I can take advantage of that, right? So what we're saying is that maybe because the dominant individuals were the ones leading it, they perceived the provision food to be more clumped, and hence they can monopolize it. Does that kind of clear that up? Okay. Yeah, and so one thing I should note too is that what I don't present here, because I'm still waiting on all the data and to do some of the analysis, is that we also need to be tracking what's happening in the forest, right? Because to better understand why the primates are coming to the road to get access to provision foods, we need to know what's happening in terms of their native foods as well. So we're tracking that across spaces and time as well. So that's an important element that I wasn't able to present on yet. So, yeah.
Hi. So actually, in that vein, when you showed the 2018 paper image of the social networks, when you compared Forest Network to Roadside Network, I had a point of information question and then an actual question. What were the colors representing in that?
Yeah, so the colors represent different age classes.
Oh, got it.
Yeah. So and the size is how important those individuals are.
So the more dominant the individual with the bigger size.
Well, no, for those, and actually the cool thing about when you illustrate social networks is you can choose what that denotes, right? So in our case, what that denoted is how many connections they have, how central they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I didn't because I thought that that's what it was, and then when I looked at the lines, I didn't really. But
Yeah.
I'm sure that when I see it.
Unless I'm wrong, and maybe the size is denoting actually, it could be sex, and so the color, one of them is denoting age, and one is denoting sex, and I thought they were combined, but maybe I'm wrong.
There's multiple sizes. It might be between this centrality, because there were some nodes on the outside that had lots
Yeah.
lots going one way, but
Right.
I don't know.
And were the edges,
But they're not.
they're not frequencies, they're proportions, yeah, or?
No. The edges are, well, they're based on frequencies. So the number, this is based on affiliative data. So the number of interactions between individuals.
So could this be explained just by there being more time spent in the forest?
Yeah. So we
that's not
accounted.
really-
Yeah, we accounted for that in the analysis. So in the paper, yeah, the paper accounts for that because there were different number of observations across the two settings. So we had to account for that in terms of the analysis. Yeah. So let me look at so Grumpy, I'm looking at this. I know he's a male. These are males. So the blue, dark blue is males. No, so it must be.
Becomes yellow on the other one.
Yeah. So it's not, the blue, I meant the outer blue. Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm trying to remember what, maybe it is the eigenvalue. Yeah. Anyway, did you?
So actually, so I was curious to know, okay, so that's helpful. And then I was curious to know how the social network dynamic changes as a function of who goes to the road and who doesn't. So do new alliances form based on who's going to the road and who's not going to the road?
Yeah, no, that's something that we're going to be able to tease apart currently, yeah. Because now we're actually collecting data over a longer period of time as well, right? So as I mentioned in the slide, we're trying to better understand at a more fine-grained level who's making decisions about, to go, and then like where they're distributed. And this is just like very coarse in the sense of road, forest, and so when we mark locations and interactions, we actually use a gradient of like on the road, roadside, within a certain distance from the road, and then interior, as opposed to just road and forest, right? Because that's an interesting.
It's not just a binary.
Exactly, because one thing that we've argued is that, the road is there. If you're literally on the road, that's pretty risky, right? Then there's right next to it. But then if you're about 3 or so meters beyond, at least prior to all the road construction, you were in the forest. And theoretically, that's safer than being on, right? But that's very different than being right against the road, right? So we wanted to capture the nuances with that. So yeah, we're going to continue to work on some of this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Ask the question, as opposed to what motivates people to go, what motivates primates to go versus what motivates primates to stay. Like, could there be a advantage for reproduction if you stay in the forest and you're not a dominant male? Like maybe you have more access to reproductive age females?
Yeah, so like making note, okay, who's missing at this time, right? And the other thing that we're doing is we're doing like sync scans of the group. So like when we perceive that not everybody's on the road, one of our field assistants stays with the rest of the group. And that way we can actually see, because prior to this point, it was just, we didn't have the research effort to be able to do this. So now we've thought, okay, wait a minute, not everybody's coming. Some individuals are staying. Who's staying, and do we see any patterns there, right? Yeah. Because often, the males, lower ranked males will often form consorts with females, and they'll like disappear for several days at a time. And that was prior to the roadside. So some males may decide to stay in the forest because, particularly when females are in, when it's breeding season. So yeah, a lot of really interesting things we can still ask about this. Yeah.
What's the traffic on this road like? Like, is it are there like certain hours where it's more like back to back, or?
Yeah, so it is. So good question, because some people have asked us, oh well, are there certain times of day that it's like, or weekends versus, and it's like the 5. It's like, that's how I always use it. It's like all day, all the time, no difference weekend. I mean, because like. And both ways, yeah. It's like, and largely it's just because it's one of two ways to get from point A to point B, and so it's just very.
24 hours? Or is it
Even in the nighttime,
Okay.
yeah. And of course, I mean, they're usually up in the cars. They usually find sleeping trees up in the cars, so they don't. But they'll stay on the road until about 5:30 or 6. So, but yeah, I've heard of traffic jams in the middle of the night on the. So it's yeah.
I just have a question. Actually, I was curious about the kind of vehicles. So are they mostly cars, or are there like auto rickshaws, mopeds? Because I think that influences like how humans interact or get to interact with the macaques. Right?
Exactly, yeah, and I wasn't able to present on today, but yeah, we're keeping track of, so we're doing traffic scans, so we actually have data on like how many cars are coming through. We didn't do that in 2016, 2017, again, because we didn't have the research effort, or the field team to be able to do that, but we're doing traffic scans, and then we're also monitoring the cars, what kind of vehicles, which vehicles are more likely to provision, because if you're on a motor, so to answer your question, there's motorcycles, there's personal cars, there's trucks that are transporting. That's a big thing because it's to transport goods from one port city to another. But we're looking at which kinds of vehicles are more likely to provision too, because if you're on a motorcycle, you're probably you're obviously more exposed too, and we've seen the monkeys charge at people on motorcycles, right? And it might be more difficult for you to give food versus if you're in a car and you've got a family and you've got lots of chips and whatever in your car or whatever. So, yeah. So we're tracking that dimension too. Yeah.
I have one more question about this, and this may not really be a valid point because maybe I'm not visualizing it right, but I'm just thinking about the geometry of the situation. So if you're a arboreal macaque in a very dense, multi-layered canopy, you could have neighbors 360 all around you. There's many more possible places where you could have neighbors. In the roadside, you're on the ground. There's no options to be above you, and I would guess very few options to be, most of them don't hang out in the middle of the road because the cars are there. So it just seems like there are fewer slots available to stick a monkey into, which could also explain that pattern.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. At the same time, the result is still the end, right? They're still, if they're not connecting, they don't have the ability to interact as much because of the function of the landscape.
I thought the edges were the proximity.
No, the lines indicate connections between individuals. So we did. So these two images are based on affiliative behavior.
Oh, so these are like grooming.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I missed
Yeah.
that part. Okay.
Yeah. You could also do it with proximity too, right? But the lines just designate the interactions. If they're
So if they're not in proxy,
they can't do that.
affiliation, so
Yeah.
you could still explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Just to build on that, have you looked at what would happen if the edges have varied thickness representing the frequency of their interactions and not just if there is?
Yeah, so my student who led this, Kristen, for the published paper, I'm trying to remember now if we actually present if we weighted the edges, because you can do unweighted ones where it's just yes or no. The visualizations get a little messy though, so that's probably why I didn't use it for here. But I think we have the ability to do that, to present that. I'm just trying to remember. I'll have to look back at the paper to see if I don't know, I don't think we presented weighted edges though.
Do you have a prediction of, there could be one version where those on the right are just going to be thicker because they'll build more affiliation. Wins the limited, I guess?
Yeah.
Or not. It could just be they're not socializing as much.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it probably could. Yeah. I mean, I guess the prediction would be that if they have fewer opportunities to interact, then you would expect those wedges to not be as, thick visually. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you followed any of the primates to see if they prefer provisions and also their weight, their health, and do any of them really switch to almost 100% of provisions?
Yeah, so preference, I don't know if we have the ability to say if they prefer, because we would have to control for, we probably have to set up some kind of experimental, like field experiment thing to see like if they make choices about one. I mean, I can visualize whether or not they pick up something and then I don't want this, and then they go for something like that, right? So that's what we're able to see. But if we wanted to track preference, we'd have to probably set up a field experiment stuff. We haven't done any biological sampling, right? So we don't capture them. Obviously, there's a lot of other interesting things that we could do, to get some biomarker information on them. But at this point in time, we haven't done any capture. Yeah.
Any other ideas about how to have access on the effect on the health?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like, so if I don't. I mean, it would be just based on observations. The only thing the only work that's been done looking at any potential health outcomes that's slightly unrelated. It wasn't done in the context of looking at provisioning because the data come from right at that transition. Is that another research team collected fecal samples to assess parasite load. And so that, there's been some work done by people who are investigating similar systems where they make predictions about, what you might see a higher parasite load in primates that are more around people compared to others, right? You might have seen from some of the images, there's other animals in the landscape, so there's cows and stuff, and so they're interfacing with other animals as well. But the one thing that I'm interested, I would like to speak with some veterinarians in Indonesia because last year, one of the things that we witnessed that I hadn't seen before was more and more of the monkeys appear to have would appear to be like maybe allergic reactions. So we're seeing skin lesions that don't appear to be like as a result of fighting. And 2 individuals are pulling their hair out. And so I don't know what's happening with regard to that. So I was hoping to bring work, get some input from some veterinarians to see and if they would be, I mean, Indonesia is can be a very difficult place to work permit-wise, and that's just to work there and then to capture monkeys. Anybody that does that kind of work and understands that that's tricky work to do, and then to get the permits to be able to capture them, collect samples, it's a bit of a nightmare.
The rate of reproduction has it been affected at all?
The rate of reproduction, yeah. I mean, this is where we don't have sustained data over time, but every year we've seen roughly around the same number of births. So at least from our social group, it doesn't appear to affect the birth rate. But we just lost an infant because of the road. So we have these gaps in data, unfortunately. But yeah, ultimately, we'd like to be able to sustain this data over time so we can actually get it kind of long-term effects, because that's obviously an important dimension, yeah.
More about the situation of the park. Are there people living in the park? And also I'm interested in knowing about the perception of the park rangers with regards to this interface.
Yeah, so this park, there's nobody lives within the national park. So let me maybe I'll go back to the the map, and it kind of gives you a sense of, there we go. So yeah, so the closest village is La Buaja, which is right here, which is about 3 kilometers, right? So we don't have anybody living inside this national park, and this is that stretch of road that we've been surveying, right? And so. But of course, monkeys they don't recognize park boundaries, of course, and so they live in the forest in and around. So people encounter these monkeys in other kinds of settings. Most notably, if they're farmers, they encounter them often in their farms, right, which ends up shaping their behavior and their perspectives towards them. But the park rangers, they as particularly the ones that we've worked with over the several years, they've have some interesting perceptions about it too, right? Because they they don't quite know what to do about it, right? And they've tried their own tactics where like, they didn't tell me they were doing this. My student told me, but they started getting firecrackers to scare them. They were trying to the approach of shifting monkey behavior. And so they were trying to scare the monkeys back into the forest. And I was like, oh, I don't know if we should really be doing that, right? And then they've tried to do like, and initially when this first started, they tried to monitor, like they set up shop at the site and like to kind of, move the traffic along and like scold people for doing, and then it wasn't always effective, and I think many of the park rangers didn't want to spend the whole day doing that. And so anyway, it's been hard to get a sustained presence at the site to be able to monitor this, right? I've talked to them about what we know from other sites, like so for example in South Africa, there's a pretty successful program that some sites have used that's like like they have people that are employed to monitor and ward the baboons away from, for example, vineyards and things like that, away from people's homes. And they are paid monitors, right? And so I envisioned early on maybe that was something that the park could emulate, because the park rangers are paid regardless of whether they're in the office, but they'd rather be in the office. So anyway, some of that's out of my control because it's, it's the park and their land. But I have good, I always try and work with them to get, we're trying to get there to see how we can help mitigate this kind of issue. But it's tricky.
Do you know if the individuals that you have been monitoring are also going to the farms outside of the park?
No, that would be too far. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we've reached the end of our time, so thank you so much for your
Thank
talk,
you.
Erin.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions. Appreciate it.